And thank you, colleagues, for sharing the time here with me, because every talk, when I talk, I take it away from you. So I'm trying to make this a joint experience, and this is what learning is all about. The more so if we are in an international, transnational context like this. The title is a combination of three things. The first thing, I've been asked by the organizer, by Forth, to sort of lead towards the end of the project phase, I'm calling it, which is the first part, promoting school leadership for equity and learning. The second part goes back to my present research, where we are researching into learning, and learning is always an experience. That's why we can't shortcut it. I took 3 slides out while you were talking, but I can't shortcut my talk anymore. And there it shows it very much depends on the here and now situation. And the here and now constitutes the future. It's the emerging future. And we are working in our Leadership Academy with this notion of the emerging future, because if it doesn't work here, if it doesn't start here, where else should it happen? And the third part is, should not just be a plastic word, a rapidly changing word. It's meant that we never know what the future will be all about. The second challenge for me is always I try to use metaphors, analogies, by finding visuals which accompany my talk, my digital part of the presentation. And I found it very difficult for this title, so I've chosen 4 of them. The first, you see, it's more structure, which leadership has to deal with. It's agency, which leadership is dealing with. This is the second part of my talk. And then, of course, the rapidly changing world is the challenges we are confronted with. This, incidentally, was 2012 at Stigma in Athens, you know, when the riots of young people, this revolt coming up. And this is something which we usually don't really associate with our school leadership situation. But when we look at the generations we are confronted with in the future, and this is just a time span from 1983 to 2013, and when you see how high youth unemployment gets up, and the titles you get, 73 million unemployed young people around the globe. The new number that should terrify Europe is 62.5%. It is suddenly not insane to imagine a youth unemployment rate of 70% in the developed world. So you can think of the significance of choosing a title, what is the emerging future? What does that mean now for I always tell my students, you know, the pupils, the students you are going to teach, they have not even been born yet. How can you imagine to know what is relevant for them? And that, of course, is crucial for any kind of leadership to keep that in mind. Just a quote from the International Labour Organization, which warned that the underutilization of young talent will have lasting economic and political consequences. Linking education and employment is perhaps the most critical reform, and career preparation cannot be left to high school guidance counselors or university placement officers alone. It must inform the way young people are educated from start to finish without sacrificing any of the socialization and self-actualization benefits schools procure. You know, these are, on the one hand, very abstract messages, but on the other hand, they go very deep if you are suddenly part of it. And I feel very dignified being here in Greece under the condition we have here at the moment, struggling and trying to find leadership, how to find the emerging future for a new European work together. When we look at the satisfaction in the life index, which a Gallup study came up across 150 countries, looking at the socioeconomic, spiritual, and cultural diversity, then people would always try to find a good job to live on, to survive, to get the subsistence to live on. And what the study shows is that it's more important than peace, freedom, democracy, a family, God, belongings. And if that is the case, of course, we can't ignore that kind of context we put our leadership in. The German sociologist Niklas Luhmann, who died a couple of years ago, looks at the systems as a whole, and he asks whether the education system is able to generate new reflective ideas out of its own resources, or whether it must depend on the irritations and structural couplings within its social environment, not least in order to be able to experience itself as difference. And here he comes again, to experience it. Probably we have to experience all these crises to learn, because learning is never visible. It's a process, and we notice that in our research, where we just experience learning situation of students included in school. It's a completely different world from what teachers actually expect from what's happening at the other end of the process. Niklas Luhmann, here you've got his dates. He was at the University of Bielefeld, and he came up with a quote which I very often use myself to reflect more on what work is all about. A system, he says, can only see what it can see. It cannot see what it can't see, nor can it see that it cannot see what it can't see. And this, of course, is exactly the trap we are always in. We have a lot of knowledge, or at least believe we have it, and we have the challenge to feel, to grasp, and this brings me again to the title of the emerging future. And when you look at the dimensions of school education, this of course is the visible part, and try, while listening to me, what is the invisible part, what is behind the stage, so to speak, because life very often is in a theater, the most important things happen at the backstage to know what is happening in the front. PISTA gives 3 dimensions of school education. One is qualification, we are all confronted with through curricula, equipping people with knowledge, skills and dispositions. And Andreas Schleicher comes with his slide all the time and says the skills, the kind of things that are easily to test and teach, are disappearing the fastest. This is the red line in this graph here. So if that is the case, the emerging future, of course, for us as leaders, both from policy to practice, is to see testing as something which contributes to this going stripe here. And we have to keep in mind what comes after PISA, for example, and this is actually leadership in contrast to management, where you just manage how to get the best test results. If we go on in PISA's model, then socialization we are all familiar with. It's the insertion of newcomers into existing orders, he says. So newcomers are both children, of course, being born, getting into this world, and people coming from all over the places. And if you look at the present situation of refugees in Austria, we have a high political debate where they should actually be placed in the European Union. We are trying to distribute them. Yeah? So how can we, in our leadership policy work, try to see that people are socialized in a productive way, which is, again, the emerging future? And I very often use this slide because it says at the bottom in German, translated into English, if we don't reach the point soon, we'll be lost. So we have been socialized in a way to go along a certain track, which of course is the track of the past. And the question is, who is responsible to get the point to the future out of this pressure and not becoming faster, moving faster and faster because of the pressures coming up. And the third part is, which probably is the most challenging in any teaching and learning situation, is subjectification, as Vista calls it. It goes back to Hannah Arendt's theories. It's the agency and human freedom, becoming the person one can potentially be, So in a classroom situation, it's not just trying to get the best or highest potential out of students, it's trying to get them further than they believe in themselves and we believe. And the same is true for our project, you know. It's not just making use of the potential to even get further and to deal with all the knowledge that is in the room. And then at the same time, we see the hindrances we have on the structural level to deal with that. Leadership, therefore, is the capacity to constantly make situative judgments, what is educationally desirable, and balance these different dimensions: qualification, socialization, subjectification, and of course dealing with the conflicts and synergies which are underpinning this process, because they are in the way of each other. But this is leadership to deal exactly with that, whereas management would be crisis management, so to speak. When we look at the first UN-commissioned World Happiness Report, that we see participation in social and economic life, ownership of one's life and life conditions, self-efficacy. These are the highest element which create happiness. And the more and more I realize, being involved in school reform, how happiness becomes part of the discussion. And Amartya Sen, he has been working in this area for a long time, says, achieving a life one values and has reasons to value. And here we come to the word agency, which I've mentioned. It goes back to Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist, who said the ability of human beings is to act, and the acting itself realized by individuals are both embedded in the term agency. And Amartya Sen again, an agent is someone who acts and brings about change, whose achievement can be evaluated in terms of his or her own values and objectives. Whatever the terminology is, going back to the Latin word of agens, what makes us do things, and this is a very, very personal aspect, is crucial in any learning process, and of course constitutes any leadership. But what about structures, you will ask? And as far as structures is concerned, we experience this kind of situation that structures don't fit anymore. They can't, because the complexity we have achieved so far in life doesn't work. When I do school leadership programs, the participants in the seminars always say, I could work so well if the ministry would not always come with new reforms. And the thing is, I have to tell them, those rails will never match anymore. It's impossible, because if we are in a confluent society, if we are in an emerging future and take that seriously, there are no matching rails anymore. But the question is, and this goes back again to Giddens, he says, the structure, if you change the structure itself, it does not immediately have an effect on agency. Our minister tried to introduce, to lower the level of classroom highest numbers to 25 students, believing that teaching would change. It didn't happen. So the other way around, if you work on agency, it does not automatically change the structure. But if we take the emerging future as a process of intertwining agency and structure, it's a very powerful way, and I've experienced that several times. For example, introducing a new faculty, founding a new faculty in a university which the rector didn't want, and now having it shows that agency and structure are necessary to build on that. But this is a different story. I can tell you about a glass of wine. Coming now to why we are here now, all the partners from the different countries, we aim at improving policy and practice on school leadership in Europe. And I was trying to see how I can give this a kind of phrasing, and it is a collaborative network in which members struggle with, and really struggle, try to manage and share knowledge by moving and improving. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, as we all know. It is very different in different countries. We are struggling in Austria, and I have heard how people in other countries are struggling the same way. And If we look at the different parts, I can skip because Kathy told about it, but the critical factors for policy implementation from the perspective of equity and learning, and I want to recap that, have to deal with political commitment and priorities, with financial resources, policy coherence, empowerment of different stakeholders, and trust in their professionalism, which is very important because in countries like in Austria where the public doesn't trust the teaching force, it's very difficult for them to work. Supportive shared dispositions to inclusive, non-socio-economically segregated schools and human resources, school leaders, capacity building, and last but not least, policy ownership rather than policy borrowing. When we come to the goals of EPNoSL in this latest phase, where we were really pushing hard to see where leadership for equity and learning could go to, we noticed that we have to address the wide divergences amongst the European education system. Some of us in this room had been involved in a project on policy cultures, and they are as differently as we can just imagine. Providing a coherent and comprehensive framework for policy development, adopting a particular participatory model, ensuring the active engagement of school leadership stakeholders in the network activities. And I think this is, again, the agency which comes back and echoes in the structure. We have had lots of activities. On the right-hand side, stakeholders engaged, from students, teachers, school leaders, to parents, etc., policy people, researchers. And we have had all different activities like peer learning as this one, national regional workshops and seminars, online discussions, case studies, webinar, EPNoSL toolkit, which was completed and we are dealing with during this PLA, and the action plans which were mentioned yesterday. We had 7 European PLAs. You see, this is the journey more or less. We started at Heraklion and we are winding up after trips from Vilnius, Jyväskylä to Nice, Rome, Munich, Berlin, and back again in this cradle of the history here in Greece. Then I don't want to go into detail too much because everybody has involved. We had different topics, different activities and outcomes. And the current focus, of course, is trying to connect equity with learning and try to do that by using networking and action planning with several themes which we had been working on and we are looking at in the different workshops coming up in the afternoon and tomorrow. And what was important here to facilitate on reflection on policy perspective, putting the stress on reflection and not just doing them, on action-taking policy approaches and policy commitment, as I mentioned before. We have case studies now of good policy practices from all these countries, which was for me quite a challenge to always understand and compare and contrast it to the situation as I experience it. And I was very impressed by the depth and the richness of experiences which are made available. And we had lots of policy practice themes, which you can see here, reaching from school autonomy to inclusion, and we will have enough documentation on those. As far as conclusions are concerned from those work, good school leadership practices show overall support leadership is necessary to support leadership at all levels of a school. Leadership, it's from student leadership up to leadership on the policy level. To provide comprehensive professional development for effective school leadership, and we have had different approaches in different countries, and to enhance networking and cooperation within and beyond the school community. But coming now back to Austria, we have created the Leadership Academy, which I presented at different occasions, trying to get together people from policy, practice, and the middle part of the system. And the lesson we learned was what Kennedy phrased in his quote, "Leadership and learning are indispensable to each other." And the challenge is, of course, how to connect leadership with practice. In our model, which we mirrored along a yin-yang model to compare and contrast leadership, but they, of course, are intertwined there. In the workshop we are doing, introducing school leaders, educating school leaders. We can talk about it in more detail. But leaning now towards the leadership part, we try to see how we can get people further from the management stance or mode towards a more leadership one. And Austria is not only known for the European Song Contest, but for a long tradition of more traditional music. And Niklas Harnoncourt I want to present as one of the foremost Austrian conductors. He's more than 70 years old and still active, and he's a kind of role model for me in a leadership sense. He says, for example, "I need the creativity of each and every musician, even if it differs from my own view. I have 80 or 100 musicians in front of me, and each one of them has his or her own opinion. It is my job to channel this and give it the appropriate direction. It makes absolutely no sense to try and force or dictate it." And how he does that, oh sorry, wrong direction. How he does that, I want to show you, if I can find, yes, here it is.
I found out kind of a program of or the idea of the symphony 1 week ago. What I want to throw away is the pathos. A pause is a pause. I won a prize for that. Lift the locomotive, down, and then throw it down. That must be extremely romantic. Now we go in the tempo more. 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 Stop. That's not enough. It must sound like a little terrifying dwarf with his teeth. Stop. That sounds like you have a glass beer before you and telling about your youth. That's beautiful. And diminuendo. That's beautiful. Try that. Dare it. I think that beauty can be only found on the edge of failing. So go one step on, and when we have too much steps, we break down. The beauty is on the edge of catastrophe. No, excuse me. You have always this problem that enormous elephant is standing on your leg, and you go very, very soft, and then the horn say, "Cowards!" Ba 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 ba. You're too cultivated. You're in a band in the moment. this is the direction. Is it a very thin Indian cloth? Yeah. So it must like a 10-meter crocodile opens his mouth. I lose my trousers. I will. What we should hear here is a telephone call from the piccolo flute. You play ba, 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 ba. You must play ba, 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 ba. So I believe you. I believe you that. Please don't forget that. It is. That's music. That's really fantastic.
Yes, and let's think of this is education and what would be the meaning in a similar way. I was really impressed how he tries to be so responsive and tries really to get those individual potential to get the full orchestra and the sound. I want to move on what underlies our work when we talk about the emerging future, because quoting him again, when he said, you know, the beauty is at the edge of failing. It means always trying hard and to go as fast as you can and see where the failing takes place. And this is the tension I always experience. And when we learn from the emerging future, this goes back to Klaus Otto Scharmer, a German. He now works at the MIT in the States, and he has tried to come up with this theory U and to see how we can get down to the very moment of when the past and the future merge. And he says, the first thing, if you remember the slide with the track and these guys were running and running faster, he says something from socialization makes us going through routines like a computer and downloading the patterns of the past. We have to suspend that, and he says we have to see things with fresh eyes, to see the seeing, how we deal things with this in this way or not other, because we have been socialized that way. And this is his first principle, open mind. If you are not open for something, then you can't really learn something new. Opening mind is not enough, because life is not just an intellectual experience, it's also an emotional experience. So the second part would be open heart. We have to sense, and I think you noticed how Hanankur was trying to sense where they are with each individual instrument and try to match his image with what it could be to help to feel what the best way of dealing with the here and now situation is. And the third one is open will, which means letting go of the old routines. And our minister, she asked me to invite Klaus Otto Scharmer to work with her senior officials in the administration. And from that situation on, she always asks them, if you bring in a new policy, are you convinced? Do you really want that? is it your will? Because you have the responsibility to all the consequences coming from that. Yeah? And then the lowest part, this is what he calls presencing. It's an artificial word combining presence and sensing, sensing what is here and now. Like Harnoncourt trying to sense what's here between him and each individual musician in front of him. And this brings us to the question, as he says, what is myself? Because it has an influence on your identity. And secondly, what is my work? For example, in the ministry, when they introduce this new policy, what is my work so that it can be followed all along? And then the second part is letting the new things come. I'll go through quickly. And then sort of achieve result. What is very important is to find a prototype, to get something very quickly, as we saw with Harnoncourt again, where he tried to get it crystallized, so to speak. And we are doing something similar here by putting policy action planning into practice. We have, as we heard yesterday and today again, and in the course of the project we came up with comprehensive planning, which is necessary, with participative planning, where we also involve critical school leadership stakeholders. Again, Harnoncourt said, I even have to win the ones who have a completely different idea of how to play the instrument. Then realistic planning to set the targets which can be achieved and not just fantasy figures, and coherent planning for proposing policies that enhance coordination between the related policies and not just pile up policy on top of each other, but integrate them. Otherwise, it's just an additive and not an integrative, let alone transformative process. And we have in the leadership toolkit, which I was really impressed by Forth, how you put that on the website. We are working on that in the workshops. We have those 8 policy areas, and we have some suggestions on how we want to, or how they might be used, like reflecting upon them, to have a kickstart dialogue and stimulating ideas. But this is what we will experience in the workshops anyway. I just want to pass on the message from the rostrum here to see how the emerging future is really also an adventure during these 2 days, which bring us to where the beauty is, close to the edge of failing. And this is how we can challenge each other and make use of our experience and see how we can learn from the emerging future and see what comes after Friday evening, when the new people constitute the continuation of this project. Thank you very much, and all success for the workshops putting future into practice.